It was supposed to be just another Sunday backyard barbecue. The smell of ribs on the grill, neighbors chatting over paper plates, the kind of ordinary California afternoon that made me feel safe. But then my eldest son stood up holding a stack of papers. His voice cut through the laughter. Dad already signed it, he declared, waving the deed for everyone to see. This house is mine now. The chatter died instantly. Plates froze mid-air. My neighbors stared at me, waiting for me to respond. My knees went weak. This wasn't just my house, it was my life, my memories, the last thing I had left after 73 years of hard work. And my own blood was stealing it from me in public while the whole block watched. I wanted to speak, but the words lodged in my throat. I felt stripped bare, humiliated, erased. What I didn't know then was that this was only the beginning. Behind that deed was a scheme so twisted that even the FBI would step in. If you were me, if your own son stood up at a barbecue and declared your house his, what would you do? Stay with me, subscribe now, and hear the whole story. The barbecue ended that afternoon, but the shame lingered in my chest like smoke clinging to old wood. I could feel every eye on me, neighbors, church friends, even children who had grown up playing in my yard. Their silence cut deeper than any words. My name is Robert. I am 73 years old, a retired carpenter who once built kitchens and cabinets across Southern California. This house, my house, was the one job I took the most pride in, not because of the oak beams or the way the sun lights the kitchen window in the morning, but because it was mine. 30 years of mortgage payments, late nights sanding wood until my hands bled, and careful budgeting with my late wife. We sacrificed vacations, new cars, fancy dinners. Every dollar went into this home. It was supposed to be the anchor for my family. I had 3 sons. My eldest, Mark, 50, now always lived nearby. He liked to call himself the responsible one, the one who looked after Dad. But I knew that tone, the way he asked about my bank accounts, the way he hovered around my paperwork, the way he treated my home like it was already his. He was a man who believed proximity was ownership. My second son, David, was 47. Softer-spoken, a man who bent whichever way the wind blew. He had a wife, Cynthia, who cared about appearances more than people. She was the type who compared everything, our car, our furniture, even our backyard fence, to the neighbors. And she whispered in David's ear that security meant getting the house in writing. My youngest, James, was 42. He lived far away in Texas, raising 2 kids of his own. He called me every week, sent pictures of my grandchildren playing baseball in the dusty fields. He told me he'd visit soon, but life kept him busy. Out of sight maybe, but never out of heart. He was the only one who spoke to me like I was still the father, not a burden. Life in our neighborhood was ordinary, the kind that Americans of my generation cling to. Sunday mornings meant church, shaking hands with Pastor Williams, nodding to Mrs. Rodriguez from across the pews. Wednesdays were HOA meetings where people argued about lawn heights and noisy dogs. Weekends smelled of barbecue sauce smoke curling into the sky while children rode bikes down the cul-de-sac. For me, that rhythm was comfort, routine, proof that I still belong somewhere. But comfort is fragile. One evening, a letter came in the mail. It looked official, Medicare logo on the top, a request for updated identification. The letter asked for a scanned copy of my driver's license to confirm coverage. I almost did it. I had my license in my hand, ready to slide it into the scanner. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the voice of my late wife in my head reminding me to be careful. The next day I mentioned it to my neighbor, Mr. Ramirez, as we watered our lawns. He frowned immediately. "Robert, don't you dare send that. Scammers use IDs like that to steal everything. Promise me you won't." I promised. I tore up the letter, but a chill lingered. Someone out there had my name, my address, and was pretending to be Medicare. I shrugged it off at the time, but later I would learn how dangerous that little detail was. Then came the barbecue. It was meant to be a celebration. Cynthia had insisted on hosting it in my backyard because the space is bigger. Mark showed up early, moving chairs like he owned the place. David smiled nervously as Cynthia arranged the table with store-bought pies. Neighbors drifted in with potato salad and paper cups of soda. Children chased each other across the grass. I stood by the grill, flipping ribs, proud to see my home filled with life. And then Mark's voice cut through the music. He stood, papers in his hands, smirking. "Dad already signed it," he said, loud enough for every neighbor to hear. He waved the pages like a trophy. "This house is mine now." At first I thought it was a joke. The music faltered. Mrs. Rodriguez stopped mid-sentence. The Johnson boy dropped his soda can on the grass. Everyone stared at me. My heart thudded. My hands shook so hard the tongs nearly slipped from my fingers. "This is my home," I stammered. "I never—" But Mark cut me off. "Don't embarrass yourself, Dad. You signed the papers. It's done." The humiliation burned hotter than the grill. I looked around at my neighbors' people I had prayed beside, fixed fences for Lent tools to. Their faces held pity. Pity for me as if I were some confused old man caught in a lie. I wanted to scream that it wasn't true that I had never signed anything. But shame paralyzed me. My voice cracked my chest tight, the words trapped. The barbecue ended early. Guests shuffled out quietly. Children were hushed away. And I was left standing in my own yard, stripped of dignity, stripped of the one thing I thought could never be stolen: respect. That night I sat in my kitchen, lights off, staring at the papers Mark had waved. I didn't even have them in my hands. He had taken them back, but their shadow lingered. How could my own son do this? And yet the deeper question gnawed at me. How could he think he would get away with it? I did not yet know that humiliation was only the first cut. Have you ever sacrificed your whole life for family only to be dismissed in front of everyone? Think about it, because that's exactly what happened to me. Sundays had always been my refuge. I sat in the same pew at church for over 30 years, the wood worn smooth beneath my palms. After service, Pastor Williams would clasp my hand firmly, telling me to keep the faith. Mrs. Rodriguez always brought tamales to share in the parking lot. People trusted me, looked up to me, asked me to fix leaky faucets or repair broken porch steps. I wasn't just a man in a house. I was part of a fabric stitched into the life of the community. That's why Mark's announcement cut so deep. It didn't just attack my ownership of the house. It stripped me of standing in front of my neighbors. In America, reputation is as fragile as glass. Once people doubt your word, especially at my age, it never quite recovers. I overheard the whispers. Poor Robert. Maybe he really did sign and forgot. Sad. His sons are just looking out for him. The pity stung worse than anger. They didn't see me as a father betrayed. They saw me as a doddering old man losing his mind. It was then I remembered another barbecue years earlier. My wife was alive, the yard filled with laughter that sounded nothing like pity. James was just a boy chasing a baseball across the grass. Mark and David carried platters of burgers, their mother scolding them for sneaking bites. She leaned against me, her hand on my arm, and whispered, "This house will always keep us together." That memory rose up like a cruel joke. Where had that promise gone? Now at 73, I stood in the same yard, hearing Cynthia's sharp laugh as if she already owned the place, seeing neighbors exchange glances heavy with judgment. The ribs on the grill burned to black while I froze, unable to move, unable to defend myself. Later that night, as the shadows stretched across my kitchen walls, I replayed the humiliation over and over. Each time I tried to imagine speaking up, shouting, fighting back. Each time my throat tightened and silence won. That silence wasn't just weakness, it was the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. And beneath that silence, a thought I couldn't shake: if Mark had the arrogance to announce this in public, what had he already set in motion behind my back? The house did not appear overnight. It rose slowly, the way an oak tree grows, inch by inch, year by year, until one day you realize it is strong enough to weather storms. 30 years ago, I signed the first mortgage papers with trembling hands. My wife stood beside me, her eyes shining even though the numbers terrified us. It was not just a house, it was the promise of stability. We had rented apartments where walls echoed with other people's arguments, where leaks dripped from ceilings we could not fix. Owning a home meant we could finally plant roots. I remember the first night we moved in. We had no furniture except a mattress on the living room floor and a single lamp. My wife lit a candle and whispered a prayer. Then she unpacked the wooden cross her mother had given us and hung it near the doorway. "This house will keep us together," she said, her voice certain. I believed her. The years rolled on. Every Christmas, the living room smelled of pine as we decorated a tree beneath that same cross. Thanksgiving meant a crowded table, turkey carved carefully, while laughter filled the kitchen. Birthdays for the boys, balloons taped to the walls, cake crumbs ground into the carpet, the kind of mess that feels holy because it means family is alive. Those memories fused with the wood and nails of the house itself. But memories alone do not pay mortgages. For decades, I worked as a carpenter across Southern California, installing cabinets, repairing decks, sanding wood until my knuckles cracked. There were nights I came home so sore I could not lift a fork, and yet I did because I had 3 sons who needed me to keep going. Mark, my eldest, was the first to benefit from those sacrifices. He was bright, ambitious, full of big words and bigger dreams. When he wanted to go to Harvard, the tuition bill looked impossible. So I sold a piece of land I had inherited from my father, acreage outside Fresno, where I once thought I'd retire. I told myself, this is what fathers do. Mark never looked back. David, my second, stumbled more. He tried business ventures that failed. Credit card debt piled high. Then his wife Cynthia gave birth to their first child prematurely, and the hospital bills stacked like bricks. He came to me, eyes full of shame, and I paid them off. I didn't even hesitate. What else could I do? I couldn't watch my grandchild come into this world already buried under debt. And then there was James, my youngest. He was the dreamer, the one who wanted to leave California and study in Texas. I mailed checks every semester, even when it meant patching old work boots instead of buying new ones. At night in my workshop, I planned oak boards and built cabinets that others sold for profit just so I could send enough for tuition. My wife used to stay up with me holding a cup of coffee, whispering that our son's future was worth the blisters on my hands. Those sacrifices were not regrets. They were choices I made with open eyes because I believed family always came first. But somewhere along the way, the balance shifted. Mark began to talk as if the house were already his. He dropped phrases like, "When I'm in charge," or "after you're gone." At first I laughed it off, but laughter faded when I noticed how often he stopped by not to visit, but to check the mail to ask where I kept important documents. He spoke the language of entitlement, not gratitude. David, under Cynthia's influence, grew restless. She compared me to other retirees who had already put things in order. She once said, "Wouldn't it be easier if the house were in Mark's name now?" Fewer complications later, David repeated her words to me awkwardly, like a man carrying someone else's opinion in his mouth. And James, well, he was far away. He called, he cared, but distance has a way of turning love into something invisible. To his brothers, his absence became ammunition. James isn't around. He doesn't understand Dad's needs. We're the ones here. I heard it often enough to believe they had started to exclude him in their plans. The warning signs grew clearer the year I ended up in the emergency room. Chest pains, nothing fatal, but enough to remind me that time was not mine forever. Medicare covered some of it, but not all. I remember lying in that sterile bed, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and hearing Mark and David whisper near the door. "This house is the only real insurance," Mark said. David muttered agreement. Better to secure it now than fight later. They didn't know I could hear them, or maybe they didn't care. When I was discharged, I tried to dismiss it. Maybe they were just worried. Maybe they only meant to protect me. But in my gut, I felt the first true crack in the foundation of trust. The house that had once been our anchor was shifting into something else, something heavy, dangerous, like a magnet pulling greed to the surface. I told myself not to dwell. I told myself that after all I had given, after all the nights sanding wood and signing checks, my sons would honor me. I was wrong. Mark's Harvard years became a shrine in our family history, though not for reasons of pride alone. I still remember the day we drove him to the airport, his suitcase bulging with books he hadn't yet read. My wife packed sandwiches for the flight as if he were still a boy heading to school. She hugged him so tight he blushed, but he never pushed her away. I stood there with my calloused hands and thought, this is why I sold the land. This is what makes it worth it. But as the years went on, Harvard was less about sacrifice and more about Mark's status. At Christmas, he came home with expensive shoes, speaking like he had outgrown us. He didn't see the cracks in the kitchen tile or the patched roof beams. He only saw the ways we fell short of his new world. When I reminded him of the Fresno land I sold, he brushed it off. "That's what parents do," he said casually, as if my life savings were a footnote. David's crisis was different. I remember standing outside the hospital nursery, seeing my grandchild through the glass wires and tubes, keeping that tiny body alive. Cynthia's face was pale, David's hands shaking. He whispered, "Dad, I can't pay for this. They'll send us to collections." I didn't hesitate. I pulled out my checkbook, my signature almost tearing the page in its rush. Cynthia smiled through her tears and said, "You saved us." But gratitude faded quickly. Months later, she complained about the old furniture in my living room, saying, "You really should modernize. This house could be worth more." I bit my tongue. James's education pulled money in steady streams. Every tuition bill arrived like a clock striking the hour, demanding more than I had. I worked late night splinters embedding deep in my fingers. My wife sat beside me, her hand brushing mine. One day she said, "James will thank you. He'll build a life free of this struggle." I nodded, though my body ached. When James graduated and sent me a photo in his cap and gown, tears blurred the picture. He wrote, "Thanks, Dad. I couldn't have done this without you." That one sentence gave me more strength than all the coffee and midnight hours combined. The house bore witness to it all. The front porch sagged under Mark's suitcases, David's broken toys, James's guitar cases. I patched the roof after storms, planted lemon trees in the yard, built shelves to hold the boys' trophies. The wood and nails seemed to soak up every laugh and every argument until the walls felt alive with our family history. But with time, shadows crept in. I began to notice Mark's eyes lingering on the deed papers whenever I paid property taxes. He once asked too casually where I kept the safe deposit key. Cynthia began dropping hints at church gatherings. It's always good to put things in writing. You never know when the unexpected happens. She said it with a smile, but her eyes carried calculation. David repeated her words in private, stumbling as if ashamed but unwilling to resist her influence. The tension grew sharper after my wife passed. In her final days, she reached for my hand and whispered, "Promise me you'll hold on to the house. It's for all of them, not just one." I promised through tears. At her funeral, Mark stayed busy shaking hands, already speaking like a host. Cynthia made remarks about future plans. James wept quietly in the corner, too far to intervene in the battles he sensed brewing. Then came the night of my hospital scare. Lying in that bed, I overheard Mark and David at the door. "This house is the only insurance," Mark said firmly. David muttered, "Better to secure it now than fight later." The words landed like nails in my chest. I closed my eyes, pretending to sleep while my heart screamed. All those sacrifices for Harvard, for hospital bills, for tuition, had not planted gratitude. They had planted entitlement. The house, once my wife's symbol of unity, was now the magnet pulling my family apart. And though I told myself not to dwell, though I whispered her words like a prayer, "This house will keep us together," deep inside, I felt the promise splintering. The papers appeared 2 days after the barbecue. Mark arrived unannounced, striding through the front door without knocking, as if the threshold no longer belonged to me. He slapped the manila folder down on my kitchen table. "Here," he said, his smile tight, "the quitclaim deed. It's official now. You signed it, Dad. The house is mine." I stared at the document. My name scrawled in ink stared back at me. Except it wasn't my hand. The loops in the letters were wrong. The signature leaned forward, rushed, not the deliberate strokes I had practiced since youth. "I never signed this," I whispered. Mark leaned across the table, his finger tapping the page. "Don't start. It was notarized. See stamp and seal. You must have forgotten. You're getting older, Dad. These things happen." The words sliced through me. Forgotten. I could remember the grain of wood I cut 40 years ago, the lines in my wife's face as she laughed in this very kitchen. And yet my son had the gall to tell me I couldn't remember signing away my life's work. He pushed the folder toward me. "It's done. Best for everyone. You can still live here, of course. But legally the house is mine. Don't fight it, Dad. It'll only get messy." Something inside me broke. To hear my own child talk about my home like it was charity, like I was a guest in the very place I built, was worse than any injury. Later that evening, David came by. He avoided my eyes, shifting nervously in his chair. Cynthia stood behind him, arms folded, lips pressed tight with satisfaction. "Dad." David began softly. "Mark showed me the papers. They're legal, notarized. Maybe you just don't remember signing." "I didn't sign anything," I snapped. "Do you think I'd forget a thing like that? Do you think I'd hand over the house without knowing?" David winced, but Cynthia stepped forward. "Robert, we all know you've been under stress. Hospital visits, bills. Sometimes memory isn't reliable. This way things are simpler. Mark takes responsibility. You can rest. Rest. As if I were already gone." I slammed my hand on the table. "This house is mine. Your mother and I bled for it. You dare stand here and tell me I gave it away?" David flinched. Cynthia did not. Her eyes glittered with triumph. The betrayal twisted deeper. One son waving a forged deed, the other too weak or too controlled to defend me. My heart pounded, my vision blurred, but the truth was clear. I was standing alone. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Whispers followed me to the mailbox, to the church pew. Pitying looks replaced warm greetings. I overheard one neighbor murmur, "Sad. Maybe Robert's losing it." It was worse than theft. It was erasure. They weren't just stealing my house, they were stealing my dignity, my memory, my very sanity. That night I sat in the darkened living room, my wife's cross hanging above the doorway. I spoke aloud to her as if she were still beside me. They think I'm weak. They think I don't remember. But I do. God help me, I remember everything. If your own children stood against you telling the world you had forgotten your own signature, would you stay silent or would you fight? 2 mornings later, I opened a bank statement. Near the bottom, a signature authorization leapt at me, my name again, approving a transfer to a new account I didn't recognize. The slant was wrong too, rushed. At the branch, the manager compared it with my ID, then looked up slowly. "It's close," she said. "But the stroke order is different. Did you authorize any transfers recently?" "No," I said. "Then we'll freeze the accounts and flag for misuse." Her word misuse sat between us like a pebble in a shoe, small but impossible to ignore. Walking home, I realized this wasn't a family disagreement anymore. It was a theft that wore my face. That afternoon, I called James. He answered on the second ring. I told him everything. At the sentence where I said, "Mark says the house is his," my voice broke. There was a pause. "Then I'm coming," James said. "I'm booking a flight tonight." The next day he was there, dusty boots, wrinkled shirt, a hug that made my ribs ache. "Show me the deed," he said. "I don't have it." Mark took the folder. "Then we get records he can't touch, hospital logs. You told me you were in the ER the day the deed was signed." "They won't give us medical records just because we ask," I said. James smiled. "They'll give them to you." At the hospital, a clerk returned with a printout. "Mr. Harris, you were admitted at 9:12 a.m. and discharged at 7:48 p.m. Continuous telemetry. You weren't signing anything anywhere else. For the first time since the barbecue breath came without pain." Outside, James squeezed my shoulder. "They can argue memory. They can't argue machines." We visited attorney Angela Mendez, recommended by Pastor Williams. She listened without interrupting, then steepled her fingers. "We're not just looking at a family dispute," she said. "We're looking at deed fraud and identity theft. Hospital logs are crucial. We'll subpoena the notary records. Every notarization leaves a log, time, ID, signature, sometimes camera footage. If someone impersonated you, we'll find it." James leaned forward. "And if we prove it, then we unwind the deed." Angela said. That evening, an email arrived. "Confirmed transfer agreement." James checked the headers. "This isn't from your bank. It's spoofed. Someone's watching you." My stomach turned. We saved everything. 2 days later, David showed up alone. He hovered in the doorway. "Can we talk?" he asked. We sat at the kitchen table. "Mark says you're making this worse," he began. "He says you'll embarrass the family." "Embarrass the family," I said. "By telling the truth, maybe we can find a compromise. Mark keeps the deed, but you get a life estate. You can live here until—" He faltered. "Until you don't." Cold filled my chest. "Did Cynthia teach you that phrase, or did Mark?" "It's practical," David muttered. "It's cruel," I said. "It makes my life a countdown." James walked in, set a folder down. "This is Dad's ER log," he said. "The day Mark claims Dad signed, he was on a monitor 10 straight hours." David stared. "That can't be right." "Mark said machines don't lie," James said. David shrank. "I didn't know," Cynthia said. "I thought maybe Dad really did forget. You believed what was convenient, I told him." The next morning, Mark called, voice falsely cheerful. "No need to get lawyers involved. Bring your documents over. Any discussion happens with my attorney," I replied. Later, Angela forwarded a breach log, a leaked email thread between Cynthia and Mark. "Once deed recorded, we list fast. Market is peaking. Split proceeds after I clear David. He'll fold if I say it's for the baby's college. Dad can keep his bedroom while it shows. Staging likes old man cozy anyway. They plan to sell my home like it was merchandise." James cursed under his breath. Angela was colder. "We'll preserve this. It proves motive." We showed David. He paled. "I didn't know about the sale. Cynthia told me Mark would protect the house. She said a transfer now would make taxes easier later. I never agreed to sell." "But you agreed to silence," James said. David buried his face in his hands. I thought maybe Dad really did sign and forgot. I'm sorry. If you're sorry, then tell the truth, I said. He nodded slowly. That evening, Mark stormed in, furious. You had no right to snoop through my emails. We didn't, Angela said on speakerphone. Your co-conspirator failed her OPSEC. It was in a public breach dump. Mark sneered. Big words from a small attorney. Bigger words from a judge, she replied. Facts are facts. Mr. Harris was in the ER. We'll subpoena the notary logs and any surveillance. If your deed is clean, you have nothing to fear. You took care of your future, I told him quietly. James stood. Return the deed, or we take this to court. Mark laughed hollow. Court it is. He stormed out. In court, Angela presented the hospital logs, the email leak, and the notary discrepancy. The journal listed an ID 1 digit off from my license with a note facial hair present. I haven't worn a beard in 30 years. The judge ordered production of the notary's video footage. When the monitor flickered to life, a man entered, stooped, glasses cap. He signed in, handed a license. From the side, he looked like me, but a close-cropped beard clung to his jaw. Then the frame caught its skin-too-smooth uniform latex stretched over bone. A mask. He moved like Mark when he carried lumber. The notary pointed him into a room. He vanished. The courtroom gasped. Angela's voice was steady. Your Honor, we request a freeze on any action tied to this deed. The judge nodded. Granted. A breath I didn't know I'd been holding slipped out. James put a hand on my shoulder. David wiped his eyes. Mark stared straight ahead, jaw-locked fury simmering. Pastor Williams appeared at the door, flanked by neighbors. We believe you, Robert, he said. Their voices wove around me like a quilt. For the first time in weeks, humiliation loosened its claws. But I knew, and James's eyes told me too, this wasn't over. It was only the end of the beginning. The manager hesitated, fingers resting on the edge of my papers. Mr. Harris, she said carefully, cases like this happen more often than you'd think. Families, caretakers, even strangers. They mimic signatures, open shadow accounts. Most people never notice until money is gone. You did the right thing coming here. Her words sank like stones. Identity theft wasn't a headline anymore, it was me. I felt exposed, as if even the ink on my name could be stolen and weaponized. Walking home, every mailbox and streetlight seemed to watch me with suspicion. The clerk disappeared, then the low churn of a printer filled the room. A single sheet slid out, time-stamped and cold. She adjusted her glasses, scanning the log, and for a moment her expression shifted from routine bureaucracy to something almost protective. Here it is, she said. Telemetry shows continuous monitoring. There is no gap. No signature could have been written elsewhere. I gripped the counter, relief and anger mixing in my veins. Machines had done what memory could not. They testified for me, impartial and unshakable. When the video froze on the latex mask, the gallery erupted. Whispers swelled, a collective gasp cutting the air. Mrs. Rodriguez clutched her handbag. Pastor Williams shook his head in disbelief. Even strangers leaned forward, eyes wide, hungry for the truth. Mark sat, rigid jaw flexing, his knuckles white against the table. He stared straight ahead, refusing to meet my gaze. For a moment the courtroom felt less like law and more like theater, an audience watching the mask of respectability crack open to reveal something rotten beneath. The house was silent when I returned from court. Not the kind of silence that rests, but the kind that waits. I set my coat on the chair, sat at the table, and stared at the cross above the doorway. For weeks it had been witness to arguments, papers, and the clatter of betrayal. Tonight it only watched. I should have felt victorious. The judge had frozen the deed. Angela's words had carried weight, and the video had cracked Mark's facade. But victory tasted hollow. I was tired in a way that sleep could not fix. My body carried the fatigue of years, but my heart carried the weight of disappointment heavier than lumber on my back. I whispered to the empty room, "How did we come to this?" I thought of the nights in the workshop. Blisters swelling under my gloves as I sanded cabinets for strangers so that my sons could study, eat, and dream. I thought of the mornings when I left before dawn, the boys still in pajamas waving as I drove off. Back then they believed I could fix anything. Broken toys, scraped knees, cracked walls. My hands were steady. My word was enough, and yet here we stood. My word questioned, my signature stolen, my memory doubted. Was it me who failed or the world that bent them? Did I raise them wrong, or did greed seep in through cracks I never saw? I closed my eyes, and my wife's face appeared, soft lines, gentle eyes, a voice that steadied storms. "Promise me you'll hold on to the house," she had said. "It's for all of them, not just one." I kept that promise as best I could. But sometimes I wondered if she were alive, would Mark have dared? Would Cynthia's whispers have carried such weight, or did her absence open the door they walked through with heavy boots? My chair creaked as I leaned back. I knew I was not the only one. Across America, fathers and mothers sat in kitchens just like mine, wondering how children they carried on their backs could one day carry knives in their words. It wasn't just about deeds or dollars, it was about dignity, respect, memory. Neighbors whispered that I was losing it, that my mind was slipping, but I remembered everything. Every nail I hammered into this house, every tear I wiped from James's cheek, every check I wrote for Mark's tuition, and every hospital bill I covered for David's child. These things were carved into me like initials in oak. Do you believe silence is strength, or is it weakness? I had been silent too long, swallowing their insinuations, letting them write a story where I was the forgetful old man. But silence had not saved me. Silence had only invited thieves to build louder lies. I thought again of my wife, her laughter at Christmas when the lights tangled, the way she stood by me in church, hand firm in mine. The cross above the door was hers, not mine, and it reminded me that promises are not made to be convenient, they are made to be kept. So yes, I was tired. Yes, the fight was heavy, but it was no longer only about keeping walls and a roof. It was about keeping my word, keeping my dignity, keeping the memory of who I was for my children, even the ones who betrayed me. I folded my hands and bowed my head. "I will not quit," I said aloud to the empty house. "Not for them, not for you, not for me." And for the first time in weeks, the silence felt like it was listening. The courthouse smelled of old carpet and dust, like every secret it had ever held clung to the walls. James walked beside me, carrying a folder so thick the brass clip barely held. Angela strode ahead, heels clicking like a metronome. She didn't look nervous. I wished I could say the same. This wasn't just about papers anymore. It was about masks, lies, and the proof that my eldest son had crossed a line I never thought a child could cross. Inside the courtroom, the judge adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "We will now review the audiovisual material submitted by subpoena from the notary office." His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much and yet still expected to be surprised. The clerk dimmed the lights. A screen flickered to life. The footage showed the lobby again, the bearded man's slow steps, hat low. But this time Angela directed advance frame by frame. Zoom. The camera magnified. My breath stopped. The skin beneath the glasses and hat rippled unnaturally when he turned. It wasn't skin. It was silicone, molded and stretched. The illusion was good. Good enough to fool a casual glance. Good enough to fool a notary with a line out the door. But slowed down, enlarged, it betrayed itself. James whispered, "It's him. It's Mark." The man lifted his head slightly, and for one instant the silicone jawline pulled away, revealing the true curve beneath. The movement was subtle but unmistakable. That was my son beneath a mask of me. Gasps erupted across the courtroom. Even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably. The judge raised a hand for order, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of disbelief. Angela rose. Her voice was calm, surgical. "Your Honor, what you are seeing is not merely impersonation. This is fraud with premeditation. A disguise was used to mimic my client Robert Harris in order to execute a deed of transfer valued at nearly $1 million. The opposing counsel objected, words tumbling, but the judge cut him off. "Sit down." I wanted to close my eyes, but I forced myself to watch. My son, the boy, I had taught to ride a bike, to hammer his first nail, to drive his first truck, had walked into a notary's office wearing my face. I felt James's hand grip mine. His voice was steady but low. "Dad, you're not crazy. You never were. This proves it." The judge leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Mr. Harris," he said, addressing Mark directly, "do you wish to respond to what we have just witnessed?" Mark's face was pale, his jaw twitching. He stood slowly. It's a misunderstanding. That's not me. Anyone could—" "Sit down," the judge snapped. "Further outbursts will be contempt." Mark collapsed back into his chair, eyes darting, sweat beading along his hairline. The courtroom buzzed like a hive. I heard snippets of mask his own son. Unbelievable words that stung and soothed at the same time. I was vindicated, yes, but at a cost I could barely bear. Angela pressed on. Your Honor, this isn't just about freezing the deed anymore. This is grounds for full nullification and possible criminal referral. We request immediate injunctive relief and protective custody of the property deed until a fraud investigation is complete. The judge's gavel came down once sharp. Granted. He adjusted his glasses again, eyes fixed on Mark. This case is not concluded, but the evidence presented today is extraordinary. Further hearings will determine charges. For now, any action on the deed is prohibited. The session ended, but the room did not empty quickly. Reporters lingered, their pens scratching, their cameras flashing. Neighbors whispered behind hands. I walked out slowly, each step heavy. The sun outside felt too bright, like the world was daring me to believe what I'd seen. James steadied me, but I barely heard his words. In the quiet of the car ride home, I finally spoke. He wore my face. James nodded, his jaw tight, and he can't hide anymore. That night, sitting at the same kitchen table, I pulled the cross from the wall and held it in my hands. The wood was smooth with age, edges worn soft by decades of touch. I kept the promise I whispered to the memory of my wife. I didn't let silence be the last word. I fought. The house seemed to breathe with me. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like a ghost in my own home. But the weight remained. This wasn't the end. The judge had frozen the deed, yes. But Mark was still out there calculating, furious. And court cases move like rivers, sometimes steady, sometimes flooding without warning. I pressed the cross to my chest. The fight is only beginning, but I'll carry it. For you, for me, for what's right. The silence around me no longer mocked. It listened, patient, waiting for the storm to return. The house was quiet when we returned from court, but not the same kind of quiet as before. This silence carried tension like the air before a storm. I dropped my keys on the counter and sat heavily in the chair. My hands still trembled from what I had seen my own son walking into a notary's office wearing a mask of my face. James brewed coffee, the old percolator rattling on the stove. He set a mug in front of me, his eyes steady. Dad, it's not over, but we've got him cornered. The judge saw the tape. People know the truth now. I nodded, but my chest felt hollow. Cornered men fight hardest, I said, and Mark isn't the type to go quietly. The phone rang that evening. The sound jolted me like a hammer striking metal. James picked up first, but the line was for me. He handed me the receiver slowly, his jaw tight. Dad, Mark's voice came low and deliberate. Enjoy your little victory. It won't last. My throat closed. Mark, you think this changes anything? Lawyers talk, judges stall. I still have power. You think James can protect you? You're old, tired. This house will be mine. Before I could answer, the line went dead. I sat there with the dial tone buzzing in my ear, the sound like a wasp trapped in glass. James touched my shoulder. He's scared, he said. That's why he's lashing out. But I knew better. Fear makes men reckless, and recklessness could still tear everything apart. That night I walked through the rooms of my house. My hand slid along the walls, the paint cool beneath my palm. In the hallway I paused, staring at the family photos, Mark as a boy holding a baseball bat too big for his hands, David blowing out birthday candles, James grinning with his first guitar. Memories that once comforted now felt like reminders of how far we had fallen. I stepped outside into the yard. The evening air was sharp, the lemon trees whispering in the breeze. I placed my palm against the brick, rough and solid, and whispered into the night. If they want a war, they'll find me standing. James joined me, silent for a moment before speaking. We'll face it together, Dad. His voice was steady, but the shadow in his eyes told me he knew the storm had only begun. The next morning, Angela Mendez called. Her tone was clipped, urgent. Robert, we've received something new. A package arrived anonymously at my office overnight. It contained a flash drive. I haven't opened the files yet, but the note said, "This proves who really forged the deed." My heart thudded. What's on it? I don't know, she said. But if it's what I think it is, it could change everything. Meet me tomorrow morning. Bring James. When she hung up, the silence returned, thicker than ever. I stood by the window, staring out at the street where neighbors once waved, but now only whispered. My reflection in the glass looked older than I remembered. Behind me, James asked, what if it's another trick I didn't answer right away? I touched the cross on the wall, tracing its edges with a finger worn by years of work. Then I said, "If it's truth, we fight with it. If it's a lie, we fight anyway." The house creaked in the wind, a long groan through the rafters. It felt less like settling wood and more like a warning. That night I sat in the dark watching the shadows stretch across the floor. Every sound, a car door slamming, a dog barking, felt sharper, closer. My son had worn my face to steal my house. Now, someone else held proof of it, dangling it before us like bait. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Then let it come." The storm had only begun. Before I went to bed, I sat once more at the kitchen table, the cross resting in my palm. The storm was coming. I could feel it in my bones and the restless creak of the house. And maybe you've felt storms like this in your own family. Maybe you've watched trust splinter under the weight of money, power, or betrayal. Tell me, what would you do if your own child wore your face to steal what you built? Leave your thoughts below. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to know what comes next, don't just watch. Stand with me, subscribe, and be ready for the truth that's still to come. Thank you for watching.